Welcome to The Explainer. All right, buckle up because today we are diving into a really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty wild text called Volume 9, The Fruit of the Poisonous Tree. It uses everything from the Book of Genesis to Gen Z slang to try and make sense of our modern political world.
Okay, let's just get right to the heart of it. This image, this is the key to the whole thing. It's all about how one single bad idea, the root of a poisonous tree, can sprout and grow into an entire system of beliefs, and eventually it bears fruit, a future that's toxic for everyone.
So the text kicks things off with this classic quote from HAL 9000, probably the most famous rogue AI in history. And it's such a perfect setup, right? It's a warning about how even the most well-intentioned plans, when they're based on a cold, rigid logic, can go horribly, horribly wrong.
All right, this is a big one, so here's the game plan. We're going to start with what the text calls the original FOFO moment, frick around and find out. Then we'll dive into the strange new vocabulary it uses for building bad futures. See how that plays out in the real world, meet these robotic ideologues called subjectobots, and we'll finish up with a couple of modern biblical parables.
The whole argument of this text is really framed by the book of Genesis, so that means we have to start right there, at the very beginning, with Adam, Eve, and one very famous piece of fruit.
So the text argues that this moment right here was humanity's very first FAFO moment. They fricked around by breaking the one and only rule they had, and they definitely found out. Suddenly they had to deal with work and suffering and all these consequences they never could have imagined. This idea, this FAFO dynamic, is really the engine that drives this entire analysis.
Okay, so how do we get from a story in a mythical garden to, well, all the political chaos we see today? The source claims we're all constantly building our own flawed futures, and to get how we do it, we have to learn its very unique vocabulary. And just a heads up, a lot of it is borrowed from Gen Z internet slang, so yep, let's get into it. First up, we've got something called mirror futures. But, and this is important, the text insists you have to pronounce it MFers. So what are they? Well, they're the toxic end goals. They're basically delusional fantasy utopias that people construct in their minds and then treat as absolute truth, even when there's literally zero evidence to back them up. It's kind of like being 100% certain you're going to win the lottery, even though you forgot to buy a ticket.
So where do these MFers even come from? Well, they don't just pop up out of thin air. The text says they grow from what it calls belief trees. And this is such a great metaphor for a person's whole ideology. You've got the roots and the trunk. Those are your deep core values that rarely change. Then you have the branches, which are the specific ideas that grow out of that core. And maybe most importantly, the whole thing is covered in a thick bark that deflects any criticism that might hurt the tree.
And here we are at the absolute core concept of this whole text. When a belief tree is fundamentally flawed, its roots are in bad logic or just plain delusion, then any idea that grows from it is considered fruit of the poisonous tree. It's an idea borrowed from the legal world. If evidence comes from a tainted source, you throw it out. Well, the text applies that same logic to ideas. The origin poisons everything that comes after.
So if these MFers are the destination, how do people try to get there? Well, the source says they use D.U.M.B goals. And this is just a brilliant, cynical flip of the old S.M.A.R.T goal system. Instead of being specific and achievable, these goals are intentionally dreamy, unrealistic, methodless, and banal. They're not for actually getting things done. They're just vague, emotional placeholders to keep the fantasy alive. It's the total opposite of a productive vision, like in the Bible, when Joseph interprets a dream and then makes a detailed 7-year plan. D.U.M.B goals are more like a Cassandrist future, just endless warnings of doom with no actual plan to fix anything.
Okay, so we've got the theory down. Now for the really interesting part. What actually happens when all this abstract stuff, these belief trees and MFers, crashes head-on into the real world of politics?
So let's look at a case study. Remember these? Melania Trump's 2018 White House Christmas decorations. They caused a massive firestorm online. The text uses this as a perfect example of a specific kind of belief tree it calls a parlor tree. And what's that? It's basically an ideological framework built for one purpose: to automatically reject anything and everything that comes from a political opponent, no matter how small or trivial it is.
And when that happens, you get reactions like this one. You see what's going on here? This isn't just someone saying, not my style. No, they're seeing the literal fruit of a poisonous tree. The color red isn't just festive, it's instantly decoded as a symbol for something sinister, all because of who picked it. And this slide just breaks down the logic of that parlor tree perfectly. Let's walk through it. The root belief is Donald Trump is evil.
Okay, from that trunk, the next belief grows: anyone associated with him is guilty. This then leads to a specific branch of logic. These decorations must be a projection of that guilt. And what's the final poisoned fruit? The truly wild conclusion that even liking the decorations means you condone murder. The entire chain of logic is locked in from the very first root belief.
All right, let's look at an even more intense example, January 6th. The text lays out two belief trees here that are just completely incompatible. There's no common ground. If your root belief is that it was an armed insurrection, then the fruit of that tree is that any compromise is unacceptable. But if your root belief is that it was a patriotic protest, then the fruit is that any prosecution is a political witch hunt. You see how there's just no room for agreement? The starting points are so different that everything that grows from them is seen by the other side as completely toxic.
And this dynamic is what creates what the text calls dream deserters. These are people you used to be on the team, They shared the same belief tree, the same mirror future, but the second they step out of line, maybe Elon Musk criticizes the left or Liz Cheney opposes Trump, boom, they're cast out. Their new ideas are instantly labeled poisoned fruit, and they're branded traitors. The text even points to the term Muscovites for his new followers, showing how these figures have to form whole new tribes.
All right, this next part is, well, it's the ethical core of the whole text, and honestly, it's pretty chilling. What happens when people get so absolutely certain about their vision for the future, their MFer, that they start acting like robots programmed to achieve it at any cost? The text has a name for these people: subjectobots. These are human beings who start to operate with the cold, moral certainty of a machine. They become so convinced that their vision of the future is the only correct one that it justifies literally any action against anyone who stands in their way. It's a really dangerous twist on Isaac Asimov's famous laws of robotics.
So check this out. These are their prime directives, and the change is pretty dark. Remember Asimov's first law: a robot may not injure a human being. Simple, universal. But for the subjectobot, the law gets twisted to focus on an opponent who is perceived as harming humanity. And just like that, the subject's personal, totally subjective view of what's good for the world now overrules everything else, including the safety of anyone they label an opponent.
Okay, let's make this concrete with another example from the text, the group it calls the Seditious Six. This was a group of Democratic veterans who actually made a video telling soldiers how they should handle potential unlawful orders from a future Trump administration. They basically created their own mirror future, a hypothetical where Trump was guaranteed to do this and then told people to act in the present based on that imaginary scenario. So, if we put on our subject spot glasses, how does this look? Well, the logic starts to make a twisted kind of sense, doesn't it? In their view, they saw a future harm to democracy posed by their designated opponent, Donald Trump. And that core belief, that imagined catastrophe, was then used to justify an action that breaks normal rules, like the military chain of command, all to stop a bigger imaginary harm.
So you gotta ask, right? Where does this incredible, unshakable moral certainty come from? How can someone be so sure about their vision of the future that they're willing to become a subjectobot? Well, the source argues it's often powered by a psychological bias we've all heard of.
And yep, it's the good old Dunning-Kruger effect. The text puts it perfectly. Subject-its are often broadcasting live from the peak of Mount Stupid. That's that point where a person has the least amount of actual knowledge, but the highest possible level of confidence. Their absolute certainty about their mere future isn't a sign of wisdom at all. It's a direct substitute for it.
Okay, so after all of that, toxic trees, bad futures, robot people, is there a way out? How do we clean up this ideological mess? Well, the text actually offers a path forward, a method for some serious intellectual decluttering. And it's called, wait for it, hella cheugy. And yeah, I know it sounds like nonsense, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It's basically just applying the Marie Kondo method to your own beliefs. You look at an old fossilized idea you've been holding on to, and you ask yourself, does this still spark rational utility? Does it actually work? And if the answer is no, you thank it for its service, and you get rid of it. You shred the fossil.
So what kind of fossils are we talking about? The text gives a few modern examples of ideas it thinks are just cluttering up the conversation. Like the idea that presidential documents are some kind of sacred totem, or the belief that we can just pause global AI development with a government decree, or even the idea that changing the decor in the White House is an existential threat. These are the kinds of outdated, irrational concepts that the source says we should just shred.
To wrap things up, the source gets really creative with two short pieces it calls, and no, I am not making this up, GigaChad side quests. They're basically short stories that reimagine biblical tales as modern political fables to really drive the main points home. The first one takes that famous story of Abraham bargaining with God over the city of Sodom, and it reframes it as a negotiation about the fate of Trump voters. The story really digs into this question of whether any number of good people inside a despised group could ever be enough to save the whole group from total condemnation. It's all about our uncompromising partisan hatred. The second side quest tackles the intense story of Abraham and Isaac, and this one is really powerful. It turns that ultimate test of faith into a modern allegory about us, about the very real sacrifices we're all asked to make, right now in our own lives, for the sake of some grand, uncertain future. A future whose goals were probably defined by someone else.
Okay, wow. So we have been on quite a journey here. We've gone from the Garden of Eden to Gen Z slang, from belief trees to the chilling logic of subjectobots. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway?
In the end, the source doesn't really give us an easy answer. It just leaves us with this massive, important question. In a world that feels full of these warring, poisonous belief systems, the goal isn't to become a better lumberjack, obsessed with chopping down everyone else's forest. The real question is, how do we become better gardeners of our own minds? How do we get good at pruning our own irrational branches? And finally, learn to tell the difference between the fruit that nourishes and the fruit that poisons?